Have you ever watched someone being treated like they don't matter at all, only to realize later that they were carrying more strength, more love, and more dignity than anyone else in the room? Because that is exactly what happened the day a billionaire decided to test a quiet maid, never expecting that her daughter would completely change the way he saw the world. In one of the most expensive neighborhoods just outside Chicago, there stood a massive estate surrounded by iron gates, long driveways, and silence that felt almost too perfect to be real. The owner of that estate was Henry Caldwell, a billionaire known for his sharp instincts, powerful decisions, and a personality that made people respect him, but never truly feel close to him. People who worked for Henry often said that he noticed everything, from the smallest mistake to the slightest hesitation, and once he made up his mind about someone, it was almost impossible to change it. Inside that mansion worked a team of employees who kept everything running smoothly every single day, but among all of them, there was one woman who moved quietly through the halls, rarely speaking unless spoken to, and her name was Rosa. Rosa had been working in that house for over 10 years, and during that time, she had never complained, never argued, and never once given anyone a reason to question her honesty or dedication. She arrived early, left quietly, and carried herself with a calmness that made her almost invisible to those who only noticed people with status or power. But Henry noticed something about her that didn't sit right with him. Something small, but consistent enough to bother his disciplined way of thinking. Every single Friday, without exception, Rosa would leave exactly at 4 in the afternoon, no matter how busy the house was or how much work remained unfinished. At first, Henry ignored it. Then he grew curious, and eventually he began to see it as a problem that needed to be tested and understood. So one Friday afternoon, just minutes before Rosa was about to leave, Henry called her into his office, where the air always felt heavier and more serious than anywhere else in the house. Rosa walked in slowly, holding her hands together as if she already knew that this conversation might not go well for her. Henry looked up at her and calmly said that he needed her to stay late that evening because there were important guests arriving and the house needed to be perfect. Rosa hesitated for a moment, then gently said that she was sorry, but she could not stay that day. Henry leaned back slightly, surprised not by her words alone, but by the quiet firmness in her voice that didn't match someone in her position. He asked her if she understood what it meant to refuse a direct request, especially when everyone else in the house adjusted without question. Rosa nodded respectfully and said that she understood completely and that she was grateful for her job, but she still had to leave on time that day. There was no attitude, no anger, and no disrespect in her tone, but something about her calm refusal made Henry even more determined to understand what she was hiding. He told her that decisions always had consequences and that people who were not flexible often found themselves replaced sooner than they expected. Rosa swallowed her fear, nodded once more, and said that she understood the risk, but there was someone waiting for her, and she could not break that promise. Those words stayed in Henry's mind long after she left the room because they sounded more important than money, more important than fear, and far more personal than anything he had expected. That evening, instead of letting the situation go, Henry did something he had never done before with any employee in his life. He followed her. He drove away from his world of wealth and perfection into parts of the city he rarely visited, where the streets were older, the buildings were worn, and life looked far less polished, but far more real. Rosa stepped off the bus and walked quickly through a modest neighborhood until she reached a small community center that looked simple on the outside, but full of life on the inside. As soon as she entered, a group of children ran toward her with smiles that felt genuine and warm, something Henry had not seen inside his own home in a very long time. Then, a young girl, around 14 years old, ran straight into Rosa's arms and hugged her tightly, calling her mom in a voice full of love and relief. Henry sat there in silence, watching a version of Rosa he had never seen before, a version that smiled, laughed, and moved with purpose instead of quiet routine. He stepped closer to the window and saw something that completely changed his assumptions. Rosa was not just picking up her daughter and leaving. She was helping children with their homework, organizing materials, comforting one boy who seemed upset, and giving her time and energy to a place that clearly needed her. Her daughter was just as impressive, moving confidently among the younger kids, explaining lessons, encouraging them, and showing a level of maturity that was impossible to ignore. Henry stood there longer than he intended, feeling something shift inside him, something that made his earlier judgment feel incomplete. But instead of stopping there, he made a decision. If Rosa was willing to risk her job for this, then he would push her further. The next Friday, he called her in again, but this time the conversation would be different, and this time it would change everything. The next Friday morning felt heavier than usual as Rosa walked into the mansion knowing that whatever happened in that office could decide her future completely. When she entered, she saw Henry sitting with two senior staff members, which immediately made the situation feel more serious than anything before. Henry spoke calmly and explained that the house required more flexibility from its staff, especially on Fridays, and that everyone needed to adjust to the new expectations. Rosa listened carefully, and after a short pause, she asked softly if that meant she could no longer leave at 4, as she always had. Henry looked directly at her and said that if she could not adapt, they would have to let her go. The room fell silent, and for a moment it felt like everything depended on what she would say next. Rosa took a slow breath, and even though her eyes began to fill with tears, her voice remained steady as she said that she understood, and if keeping her promise cost her job, then she would accept that outcome. Henry watched her closely because he had expected fear, maybe even pleading, but instead he saw something stronger. He asked her one final question, and this time his voice was quieter than before. He asked why leaving at 4 every Friday mattered more than her job. Rosa closed her eyes briefly, then answered in a voice that carried years of emotion. She said that her daughter had once felt invisible, lost, and forgotten, and she had promised that no matter how hard life became, she would never let her feel that way again. She explained that the community center had helped her daughter during the hardest time of their lives, and that every Friday she went there not just as a mother, but as someone giving back to the place that gave her child hope. Then she said something that stayed in the room long after she finished speaking. She said that poor parents often miss important moments, not because they don't care, but because survival forces them to choose work over love, and she refused to let that be her daughter's story. Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her and said something unexpected. He told her to bring her daughter the next day. Rosa didn't understand why, but she nodded and agreed. The following morning, she walked into the mansion with her daughter, Lily, who looked around with curiosity, but not fear. Henry greeted them and asked Lily to sit down, then began asking her questions about school, life, and what she wanted to become in the future. Lily answered calmly, thoughtfully, and with a confidence that surprised everyone in the room. Henry tested her further, giving her small challenges, questions about logic, reading, and problem-solving. Each time, Lily answered with clarity and depth beyond her age. Then Henry asked her what she wanted to become. Without hesitation, she said she wanted to become a teacher. Henry asked why she would choose that instead of something more powerful or profitable. Lily smiled gently and said that someone once helped her when she felt like she didn't matter, and she wanted to be that person for others. The room fell silent. Henry looked at Rosa, then back at Lily, and something inside him changed completely. He stood up slowly and admitted that he had been testing Rosa, trying to understand what she valued more. Then he said that she had passed. Rosa looked confused, but before she could speak, Henry placed a folder on the table. Inside was a full scholarship for Lily to attend one of the best schools in the state. Rosa broke down in tears. Lily stared in disbelief. But Henry wasn't finished. He told Rosa that she would no longer work as a maid. Instead, he offered her a leadership role in his foundation, helping children and families like the ones she had been supporting all along. Rosa couldn't speak. Lily stepped forward and asked why he was doing all of this. Henry looked at her and said something simple but powerful. He said that the world ignored her mother, and yet she still chose to give, and people like that don't work for him, they work with him. In that moment, everything changed, not just for Rosa and Lily, but for Henry himself. Because sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones who teach us the most important lessons. And sometimes, the greatest strength is not found in power or wealth, but in the promises we refuse to break. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because there are many more stories like this waiting for you. Stories that remind us that behind the quietest people, there is often the loudest kind of love.